The Street Fighter 6 launch that took place last year went down a roaring success, with the title quickly becoming one of the most popular entries in the series. Rewind the clock, 8 years ago though, the Street Fighter brand was in a very different place. In this period, Capcom would not only put out what many felt was a lousy addition to the franchise, but a game that was so grossly lacking in features that to most it felt like it wasn't even finished. Despite this video game's half-baked nature, the greedy Japanese video game developer and publisher would release the title to be consumed by the public anyway, resulting in a backlash that would lead to negative reviews, complaints, and some people choosing to boycott the company altogether. The game quickly became a laughingstock and a complete joke, with the title being such a mess that, as recently as just last week, Capcom are still apologising for their misdeeds. So with that said, join me today as we discuss their statement and everything that went wrong with this infamous title. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the Street Fighter V disaster and why Capcom claim to still be sorry about it. Yeah! To understand the release of the most complacent video game ever put out in the history of Street Fighter, we first need to look to the recent past, before this game's release and Capcom's attitude as a whole regarding the state of gaming, or fighting games more specifically. Throughout the first half of the noughties, Capcom had pretty much decided to put chronologically numbered entries in the Street Fighter series to bed, with them choosing to focus on other genres instead heavily on fighters, placing more emphasis and marketing power behind the likes of the Resident Evil and Devil May Cry series. Capcom held a strong belief that the genre's time had passed, and the fighting game fad was over, with them believing sales for the likes of Street Fighter 3 and its iterations, along with the PS2 launch title, Street Fighter EX3, all serving as evidence for this. So Capcom franchises like Rival Schools and Darkstalkers would instantly and forever become a thing of the past. This, however, would quickly be proven wrong when it was noticed that an incredible amount of people began playing Street Fighter 2 on Xbox Live, with the HD remake of the game illustrating that there was still very much an audience for these games. Noting this, Street Fighter 4 would be given the green light, a graphically suitable game for the new generation that featured all the classic Street Fighter 2 characters that everyone knew and loved. Street Fighter was once again the king of fighters, and Capcom fighting games were once again very much on vogue. The well-received Marvel vs. Capcom 3 game and the quirky Tatsunoko vs. Capcom would soon form the new lineup, and fans were even excited to play the new iteration of the fourth Street Fighter game known as Super Street Fighter 4, the entry that gave us the now beloved jury. However, it wouldn't be long until a combination of fighting game fatigue and sketchy corporate practices would turn the mainstream away from Capcom fighters all over again. So let's begin to discuss the Capcom fighters of the 2010s that would repeatedly put a sour taste in consumers' mouths. Out of these being discussed, we got Street Fighter X Tekken, a game that no one asked for at the time. Sure, we had always wanted to see Street Fighter vs Mortal Kombat, but since Street Fighter was predominantly 2D and Tekken was predominantly polygonal, this wasn't a crossover many desired over this period. Still, it wasn't so much this game's existence that annoyed people, but the extremely shady practices that would surface around the way Capcom were choosing to approach the DLC for the game. Just for clarification, by this point in time, most people didn't have a problem with DLC for fighting games in the era, and if anything, saw it better than the old method of having to buy an entire new edition of a game to be able to play as extra characters. But it was the implementation of the DLC that was a big issue with this one. You see, people believe that DLC should be extra content created for an existing game at a later date, in order to enhance the existing base experience. However, the Street Fighter X Tekken DLC was nothing like this at all. Instead, it was discovered that Capcom had created 12 extra characters for the game prior to launch, and had already placed them on the game's disc, but behind a paywall. This meant, to be able to play as the fighters that were already on a disc, Capcom expected gamers to pay more, an additional $20 in fact. Learning about this, players were rightfully disgusted with this news. In protest, many would choose to hack the game, gaining access to the characters before their so-called official releases. Also in the 2010s, Capcom would bring to us Ultra Street Fighter 4, despite Yoshinori Ono stating to us in the past that he had no intention of carrying Street Fighter 4 into Hyper Street Fighter 4 or Ultra Street Fighter 4, literally the name of the bloody game that came out. Liar! He states that this was because he was aware of the mistakes Capcom had made in the past, so didn't want to repeat them. Building on this old quote, he states that Super Street Fighter 4 should be the distinctive end. Not only did we indeed get an Ultra Street Fighter 4, but before that, we got a Super Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition, showing Capcom to be double liars in this instance. Ultra Street Fighter 4 would lazily see the Street Fighter characters created for Street Fighter Cross Tekken being added into the game, with some balance changes and new modes being applied too. To give the devil its due though, Capcom did allow Super Street Fighter 4 owners to buy Ultra Street Fighter 4 as a DLC upgrade for $15, so at least there was some goodwill on display here. This was not so much the main issue with the game though, but instead the PS4 version of the game. That was dreadful compared to its previous generation counterparts. Littered with bugs, glitches and a number of other debilitating problems such as input lag, this resulted in an at times choppy and unresponsive mess. What makes this particularly heinous is this game was marketed as the ultimate way to play Street Fighter 4, but the game performed so poorly that it ended up being pulled from both the Capcom Pro Tour and EVO 2015, despite Sony being a sponsor of the tournament.
They won't remember.
Embarrassingly, the Xbox 360 version of the game was playable instead. To make matters worse, this wasn't the only so-called Ultra Street Fighter game the decade would receive, as the Nintendo Switch would get Ultra Street Fighter 2. This unapologetic cash grab was not just seen by most to be one new Street Fighter 2 iteration too many, but previously, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix for PS3 and Xbox 360 had been released as a cheap budget title. But suddenly, if you wanted to enjoy a similar game on the Nintendo Switch, Capcom were expecting consumers to pay AAA prices. Looking more predatory than even Philip Schofield,
"What do you want me to die?"
Capcom would charge gamers $40 a pop to essentially play Street Fighter 2. Compounding what a rip-off this was, just 12 months later, for the same price, Capcom would release Street Fighter 2 along with 11 other Street Fighter iterations of the franchise, all on one cartridge, demonstrating further what a joke the price of Ultra Street Fighter 2 was. During this decade of destruction, Capcom would also release Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, the video game that effectively killed the Marvel vs. Capcom lineup. With Marvel now being owned by Disney, 3-on-3 action would be dropped for more simplistic 2 vs 2 combat, with the crossover franchise's beloved cast of fighters being swapped out for those who Disney planned to build their cinematic universe around. This would result in the entire cast of the X-Men being dropped from the game, who had been a key fixture in every Marvel vs. Capcom game up until this point. This was likely due to the fact that Fox still had the rights to make X-Men movies at the time, so while they could have had them placed in the game, they instead chose to pretend they didn't exist in order to likely try and hurt Fox. Rather embarrassingly, Capcom community manager Combo Fiend would publicly try and defend the dastardly Disney and cash-grabbing Japanese company, as when he was asked about the lack of X-Men in the game, he would deny them of their importance, questioning if modern-day fans even still knew who the X-Men were, and would reduce the importance of the characters down to no more than functions, stating that characters like Magneto are just doing things, and Captain Marvel can do the same thing. While this soulless game sold poorly and rubbed many the wrong way, it is of note that after leaving Capcom, Combo Fiend landed on his feet. Today he works for Marvel Games and had a producer role working on that massive Spider-Man game. I guess shilling for our evil corporate overlords does pay off. For instance, Capcom chose the Completionist to be part of a Street Fighter 6 promotional campaign instead of me. All jokes aside, looking back through the 2010s, there was a clear trend of Capcom failing to deliver the best fighting games at the best value for money, but in many people's eyes, Street Fighter V, that decade's mainline new Street Fighter game, featured the most terrible launch of all of these fighting games. So with that said, now we have full context for this era, let's discuss the car crash that was the Street Fighter V launch. First off, it's worth stating that even prior to this all happening, a portion of the fandom were already extremely pissed off with Street Fighter V, which unlike Street Fighter 4, would be locked to just one console, the PlayStation 4. As for the reasoning behind denying Xbox owners to play this one, Capcom's Matt Dahlgren would state that part of the reason we partnered with Sony is we share the same vision for growth potential in the fighting game space. I'd say the key aspect is working with us on executing cross-platform play. This is going to be the first time we've ever united our community into a centralised player base. In other words, Xbox gamers weren't welcome to this party. As we got closer to the game's launch, men of culture would begin to notice significant changes to the game that were greatly altered from the beta version of the title. This included camera angles being changed when both Cammy White and R. Mika were in action. No longer could we see R. Mika slapping her butt, for example. So some would complain about unwarranted censorship being applied to appeal to modern sensibilities of the people who weren't interested in playing the game anyway. When the game finally hit the market, the title would instantly be hit with wave after wave of criticism, with it featuring a severe lack of single-player content and far less characters than previous recent Capcom fighting game iterations. Many felt a lack of an arcade mode was criminal, as there had never been a Street Fighter game in history previously without one. This meant that the only way to really get enjoyment from this game would be to play it online, which would have been fine if its online performance wasn't so terrible and unstable. This was in fact so bad that fairly swiftly Capcom's Yoshinori Ono would feel the need to issue an apology to fans for a host of different server issues. He would refer to Street Fighter V as a learning experience. Even Capcom CEO Kenzo Tsuchimoto would opt to admit that Street Fighter V was both seriously lacking in content and needed a lot more polish. Structurally, the game was a mess and labelled by Edge magazine as a missed opportunity. The sparse title received many harsh reviews, with Slant stating that the game essentially gives the middle finger to a sizable portion of the audience due to the lack of content or game modes. Even more hilariously, the Guardian newspaper refused to even give the game a score, labelling Street Fighter V as an unfinished half-cooked catastrophe, which they believed had been put out to meet a financial deadline rather than any sort of artistic one. After years and years of refinement, and wave after wave of DLC, Capcom slowly fine-tuned their so-called service game into something that was, well, decent and serviceable. However, the issue was that the mainstream interest was lost by this point, leaving only the diehards behind to care about Street Fighter V. Thanks to tournaments with large prize pots and a constant slew of content, Street Fighter V eventually did have a dedicated audience. However, who knows how successful this fighting game could have been if Capcom had have been professional enough to release a finished game from the offset. Reflecting back on their dreadful mistakes throughout the 2010s, it seems like Capcom reflected themselves on what was so despised about Street Fighter V and other products they were selling over the period, and ensured that Street Fighter VI was a more complete product from day one of launch, thus hooking in the mainstream and bringing them back to Street Fighter for the first time in years. Still, we occasionally do still get some heinous predatory practices, such as the disgustingly priced Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles costumes in the game, but this is nothing compared to what went down in the previous decade. It seems that to Capcom, they've finally begun to learn their lesson regarding treating consumers with a little bit more respect, with us now just waiting for Warner Brothers and NetherRealm Studios to start doing the same with Mortal Kombat 1. A case could be made that the aggressive microtransactions and paid content involved with that one make 2010's Capcom look like saints comparatively. Still seemingly haunted by the Street Fighter V launch to this day, Street Fighter of Japan's official Twitter account would tweet for Street Fighter V's 8th anniversary, apologising again for the botched release, stating that from the beginning to the middle of the release, there were network issues, lack of content, etc. We are truly sorry for the content that did not meet the expectations of many of you. From the middle to the end of the game, the Street Fighter V development team did a lot of self-reflection and worked hard to resolve the issues as much as possible. Above all, the most important point was that I was able to apply this reflection to Street Fighter VI. I once again feel that the past 8 years have been spent together with everyone. Thank you very much. While such a tweet lacks any sort of signature affixed to it, many assume it is the director of Street Fighter VI, Takayuki Nakayama. Looking back on everything we've covered today, it's easy to negatively look back at how shady Capcom's practices were when it came to creating fighting games in the 2010s. But bearing in mind Street Fighter 6 is already as refined as it is, with just its base version, imagine how good it could become if it's as tweaked as much over the years as what Street Fighter 5 was. Hopefully it seems that the 2010s losses are going to be the 2020s fighting game gains. Anyway, if you enjoyed today's video, then you might enjoy my recent upload on why Mortal Kombat 1 is in trouble. Yeah, cheerio.